Hi, my name is Sven, welcome back to my channel, hope you're doing great. So, the people of Dehancer have reached out to me for a review on their plugin, and they will do a free giveaway for one of my subscribers, but more on that later. Let's look at what it does, and if you already watched any other review online before, make sure to still stick around here as I try to go very in-depth. So, Dehancer is a plugin for DaVinci Resolve and other programs like Premiere and Lightroom that tries to emulate real film characteristics. It comes with a huge amount of sliders for all sorts of things, so let's look at all of them. And by the way, they also recently introduced an iPhone app, so you can grade your images on mobile as well. The first thing you will see when you load the plugin is a sudden change of color that is quite strong. It comes with a few default settings already applied. And this for me personally is one of the things that I don't like about it, but at least when you scroll all the way down, you can disable it here and start from scratch. And we will have to enable each section manually from now on. The first part of the plugin is the color management, and by default it is set to Rec 709. So this means when you want to use it like this, you will apply it on Rec 709 footage or footage that has already been converted to Rec 709 with a CST or a LUT before. But here you can also find a bunch of camera models if you want to apply it directly on the footage. So for example, when you select the Arri cameras, it will know the right input color space and then convert to Rec 709 internally by itself. And this is also one thing I don't like about it, to be honest, because maybe I want to use it in log C but also output log C. And this is not possible as it already converts to Rec 709. So I'm somewhat limited by the tool here. Now, there are scene-referred workflows here as well, like DaVinci Intermediate and ACES, so that would mean you could work color managed and therefore be able to deliver to various displays like P3 and HDR, but from what I found, the implementation of those is actually not that great, and we will see those in a minute. So here in the first section you will find sliders for exposure and white balance. If you need to correct something, you can do that here. I have a full video on white balance techniques on my channel, where I compare all the tools that are natively available in Resolve if you want to check this one out. The temperature and tint sliders in Dehancer feel similar to temp and tint in the primary palette, even though they look slightly better. But for proper adjustments, I'd use any of the other techniques discussed in that video. Now the next section is probably the most important one, the film profiles. Here you will find an incredibly huge selection of film stocks, essentially LUTs that you can modify with one slider to either push or pull them. Now the question for film enthusiasts is, are they legit? Are they accurate? And if you ever worked with film, you know that even images from the same stock can look different. Film is never consistent, so take this with a grain of salt. But are the stocks somewhat close to real film? Well, I don't know about all of them, but I at least worked with the Kodak Vision 3 500T stock and it held up quite okay. In my case, I had to do some extra work to match it with true film, but it got me somewhere in the right ballpark. The film developer section is, as far as I understand it, meant to be used when you don't know the color space of the footage. You can stretch the image with the contrast boost and gamma correction to a display ready state, but since I usually work color managed, I don't use this tool. The film compression can be useful when you want to tame down some highlights. I did, however, so far only find use for the impact and the tonal range sliders. And the expand tab is something I personally do not use. It's practically a contrast adjustment again, but I would rather do that with the native tools in Resolve. The print tab can be a bit more useful. First of all, you can select one of those profiles, for example the classic Kodak 2383 print LUT. But you can then also modify the exposure and contrast of the print here, as well as applying some density and saturation. Then we will find the color head, which tries to emulate the process of printing film. Here you have 3 sliders to control the color balance of the final image. It is somewhat of a look building tool if you ask me, since it defines the overall tint and everything going out of the plugin. Dehancer claims to work in a subtractive color model that realistically emulates this process. And I can't confirm that since I have never printed anything to film myself, but it definitely manipulates the colors in some way. I personally do not really use this tool as I'm more familiar with Resolve's own tools. And also in this section you can tint the shadows, midtones and highlights differently with 3 designated sliders. But again, I usually do that with other tools anyway, so let's move on. Now, one of Dehancer's best tools in my opinion is their grain. They did improve the grain algorithm compared to earlier versions I tested a few years ago. For one, you get a selection of presets that work with predefined values, but you can tweak it if you select custom from this list. Also, the grain automatically applies a certain softness when you increase the grain size and the grain intensity. And this is quite handy as it makes the grain feel like it's part of the image and not just an overlay slapped on top. You can tweak the response of the grain for shadows, midtones and highlights, and you get a few extra sliders for different processing modes. But to be honest, leaving them at default is probably the better idea. Now, what would a film emulation plugin be without halation? Again, there are a handful of presets here, which makes it really easy to apply the halation. But if you select custom, you can of course now tweak the settings. To be honest, so far this is probably the best looking halation from a third-party plugin that I have seen so far. I do have to say though that Resolve's Film Look Creator in my opinion looks comparably good, but is more convenient to apply. With Dehancer's halation, I find it hard to understand what every slider does and how to dial in the right amount of halation. It can look cool, but I find it too complicated. Underneath the sliders, you will find this checkbox for mask mode, where you can just look at the halation on its own. I do find that this image, however, always turns out way too dark to actually see something, so it becomes a bit useless to me. It kind of works when you use Dehancer in Rec 709 or with any of the camera presets, but I like to work scene referred, and there it doesn't really work great. The bloom is an edge blur that looks for high contrast edges and adds them on top to create a gloomy image. And this can look nice, especially if you're going for a soft and dreamy look. But I personally don't find any use for this as it does not create the look I would want if I was going for this aesthetic. And I also could quite easily recreate this look by using the stock Edge Detect OFX, a blur and a layer node. The next section is meant to create dirt and other flaws of film. And I get that this can be aesthetic and that you may want this, but I have one problem with this. They create it based on the random seed, so every time you hit play, every time you pause, even every time you change any parameter anywhere in the plugin, the dirt pattern changes. So it's completely unpredictable in that sense. In one render, a dirt element might be on an actor's face and is quite distracting, and when you want to check again, suddenly it's gone, or even worse, it's the other way around. For such things, I would much rather recommend video overlays for this exact reason. Also, it really slows down the performance, but more on that later. The gate weave and film breath. These two also emulate the behavior of film and its inconsistencies, so they add some slight wiggle for the position and scale as well as a bit of RGB flickering. And this can work okay, but Resolve also already has tools for that, and again, it's based on a random seed. With the overscan, you can create some quite nice looking overscan effects. However, in my opinion, I would still use a video overlay for such things, because again, this would give you more consistent results. Dehancer renders these elements randomly as well, so they are unpredictable. As I said, they look quite nice, but one thing they should rework here is how the other effects are not blending in over the gate. With real film, you would get grain and halation bleeding over the edges of the gate, which is not the case with Dehancer. It's a subtle thing, but even the Film Look Creator does it right here. And finally, the vignette and monitoring options are something I don't use as well, so we can skip these. So I personally would set up the plugin inside my working color space of DaVinci White Gamut Intermediate. I would then first disable all the tools and enable the film negatives, the grain and maybe the halation to build a look that I like. Maybe I would also try out the print section, as sometimes this goes really well with the film negatives. Now, let's talk about the good things and the bad things about this plugin. The good things first. The collection of film stocks is quite large, maybe a bit too large for some people, and I personally would find myself using the same 2 or 3 stocks anyway, but it is something that I still like about the plugin. The grain and halation feel quite realistic from an aesthetic point of view, and I like that you can just use the presets to get a look easily. I still do find that in the grain section there are too many sliders and options here, especially the grain versus noise and negative versus positive, as I so far only ever liked the look of the default settings. Besides those, there are quite a bunch of problems I found, and since Dehancer asked me to make an honest review, I will talk about them. The first one, which would instantly be a deal breaker for many studios especially, is the really bad implementation of ACES. You have to understand that ACES is a huge color space intended to cover most capturing color spaces and all the display color spaces. However, the way Dehancer works is the following. They convert the ACES CCT signal to Rec 709 with the official ACES ODT and its soon-to-be outdated RRT. Then they applied all of their tools inside of Rec 709, and then they convert back to ACES CCT with the inverse Rec 709 ODT. And you can easily recreate this by setting up these nodes. And this has many problems. First of all, you are limiting the color space to Rec 709, so delivering P3 or HDR spaces later is already a problem. Second of all, the official ACES ODTs are not perfectly inverse. That means by just applying the plugin in the clean slate mode, so all of the tools are disabled, you are already clamping the signal. Look at this graph, there are no highlights above 100 nits, and a similar thing is happening when you use the DaVinci Intermediate preset. Again, they convert from DaVinci Intermediate to Rec 709. Here they already apply the DaVinci tone mapping and apply the forward OOTF twice, and then in the end they convert back to DaVinci Intermediate with the inverse DaVinci tone mapping and the OOTF twice. Now the next problem is also related to clamping. When you stretch the signal a bit too far before going into Dehancer, you will get artifacts. My guess is that there is a modulo function somewhere in the code that flips the incoming signal over, and this can become a problem easily when you push the specular highlights up with tools like the HDR wheels or the color wheels. Now, there's also performance. As I said earlier, tools like grain and halation affect the performance strongly, so you need a quite fast computer to really work with this plugin, especially if you intend to make use of all of its tools. But I tested this on a MacBook Pro with the M4 Pro chip, and in a UHD timeline the playback already dropped to 21 FPS when I enabled grain and halation, and this was in the plugin's fast mode, so not the high quality mode. So who is it for? In my opinion, Dehancer is a nice tool for the aesthetics if you are just going for a quick and easy solution, and you have the budget for a license and a fast computer. You can use it as an OpenFX on the edit page as well, so you don't even need to enter the color page. But if you're thinking about incorporating it into existing workflows, especially working scene referred and with proper color management, however, I wouldn't recommend this tool as it has major flaws as we saw earlier. But if that's unimportant to you and you're just in for the looks, and that's totally fine, you should check it out yourself. There's a free demo on their website, and the people over at Dehancer were nice enough to provide one free license for one of my subscribers. So we are doing this giveaway, and here's what you have to do in order to enter. You need to be subscribed to my channel, and you have to leave a comment with "I want Dehancer" under this video until the 6th of March. I will announce the winner shortly after in a YouTube short here on my channel, so make sure to look out for this one as well. But until then, I will see you in the next episode.